For over a century, the story of the United States was basically defined by this simple, steady, upward trajectory of progress, right? Like, things just keep getting better. But then, a profound mystery emerged, one that completely shattered that century-old promise and revealed this hidden, almost invisible crisis lurking right beneath the surface of the American dream. Welcome to This Explainer.
Okay, let's dive into this incredibly bizarre American anomaly that kicked off around the year 2014. After literally decades of continuous progress, that steady upward line of U.S. life expectancy, it suddenly just stalled. And then, for 3 consecutive years, it inexplicably began to fall. Now, you gotta remember, this wasn't caused by a war, and it wasn't some sudden viral pandemic. When you compare us to other wealthy developed nations, places like Germany or Japan, whose life expectancies just kept rising steadily, this drop in the U.S. stands out as a uniquely terrifying historical anomaly. So, what exactly was happening?
Well, the answer finally came in 2015 when 2 Princeton economists, Angus and Angus Deaton, who actually went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, by the way, made a pretty shocking discovery. They uncovered a quiet epidemic, and they gave it a name, deaths of despair. They figured out that this decline wasn't caused by a new biological disease, like a novel strain of cancer or something. Instead, it was a sociological symptom of a profound systemic economic collapse. People were, quite literally, dying from pain, hopelessness, and the slow, agonizing disintegration of their entire way of life.
Section 1. The Great Education Divide, a rigid border in modern America. Let's move on and see how this builds, because this crisis absolutely does not affect all Americans equally.
Now, what's really fascinating, and frankly terrifying, is how a 4-year degree has morphed into a literal survival border. When Case and Deaton dug into the mortality data, they found that for the college-educated class, life expectancy was actually continuing to rise. They remained economically secure, socially integrated, all that good stuff. But for the non-college working class, life expectancy was in a rapid downward spiral. A college diploma in America is no longer just some academic achievement. It's become a rigid border separating health and stability on one side from systemic economic abandonment and total despair on the other.
And this brilliantly illustrates the immense scale of this vulnerability. We're not just talking about some small, marginalized fraction of the country here. Only about 36% of American adults actually hold a 4-year degree. That means 64%, the vast, vast majority of the population, the literal backbone of the working class, falls entirely on the vulnerable side of this educational divide.
Section 2. 3 Pillars of Despair. The behavioral medical causes. Let's break down the specific behavior-related medical causes that researchers actually use to classify these tragic deaths.
So Case and Deaton categorized deaths of despair under 3 distinct pillars: drug overdoses, alcoholic liver disease, and suicide. The absolutely crucial point here is that while we often talk about these as completely separate issues, the opioid crisis over here, alcoholism over there, the mental health crisis somewhere else, sociologists argue they're actually just symptoms of the exact same underlying disease of hopelessness. When life becomes unbearable and the future just offers zero hope, people seek ways to escape the pain, either by self-medicating or, tragically, through the ultimate loss of hope.
The sheer scale of this crisis is staggering. By the year 2017, deaths from just these 3 causes reached an almost unimaginable 158,000 people per year in the United States.
To put that into perspective and make that massive, abstract death toll truly understandable, Angus Deaton offered this really visceral comparison. That annual death toll is the equivalent of 3 fully loaded Boeing 737 passenger jets falling out of the sky every single day, year after year. Let that sink in for a second. If that were happening in aviation, the entire world would ground to a halt instantly, no question. Yet, because these deaths happen quietly, individually, and largely to the working class, this epidemic remains basically invisible.
Section 3. Structural Roots and Causes, 40 Years of Policy Shifts. Okay, let's dive into the history to uncover the macro-level economic and structural shifts that laid the absolute groundwork for this slow-motion disaster.
This brilliantly illustrates the tragic 40-year progression we've seen. It all started with deindustrialization, globalization and automation completely wiping out manufacturing in the Rust Belt. That directly led to the rise of low-wage service work, which, let's be honest, just couldn't support families. So what happened next? Family instability. Marriage rates absolutely plummeted. And finally, civic decay. Participation in local community organizations, unions, and churches, the very safety nets that gave people a real sense of belonging, sharply declined.
If we compare the mid-20th century economy to today, the psychological loss becomes crystal clear. Think about it. A mid-century factory or mining job wasn't just a paycheck. It provided real security, a pension, a sense of pride, and social standing in the community. When those were replaced by modern retail or gig economy work, workers got stuck with low wages, massive insecurity, zero upward mobility, and incredibly isolating conditions. The loss of those stable jobs essentially destroyed the psychological dignity, the structure, and the social standing of working-class men and women.
Now, compounding this intense loss of income is the unbelievably heavy burden of the U.S. healthcare system. Unlike other wealthy nations with universal coverage, researchers constantly point out that the American system is essentially run for corporate profit. Employers pay massive premiums for private healthcare, which directly suppresses the wages they can actually afford to pay their workers. And worse, medical debt is literally the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. This adds an immense, crushing layer of financial anxiety to low-income families who are already struggling just to keep their heads above water.
And right into this massive void of economic pain stepped corporate exploitation. As the researchers outline, pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin, falsely claiming it was non-addictive. And here's the really dark part. They specifically targeted these economically depressed working-class communities where heavy physical labor naturally led to high rates of chronic pain. They were essentially selling a chemical solution to a deeply rooted social problem.
Now, what's really interesting about this is seeing exactly how the corporate search for profit supercharged the crisis. It happened in a very specific, tragic sequence. Step 1, the initial wave of prescription OxyContin just flooded these towns. Step 2, when the government finally woke up to the danger and restricted those prescriptions, the addiction was already deeply entrenched, which led directly to Step 3. Millions of Americans were pushed into cheaper, far deadlier street alternatives like fentanyl and heroin. It took a slow-burning despair and turned it into an absolute, fast-moving catastrophe.
Section 4. Rebuilding the Dream, Healing the Economic Divide. Let's move to Reichs and see how this builds toward the structural remedies that economists say are absolutely required to heal what is, right now, a totally unsustainable economy.
So the crucial point here is that we must look entirely beyond simple medical fixes. Treating an overdose doesn't cure the profound hopelessness that caused it in the first place, right? Economics argue we need to actively invest in systemic reforms, reforming the predatory costs of healthcare, rebuilding working-class dignity by actually supporting manufacturing and labor unions, and reconnecting communities by funding local social infrastructure. We literally have to bring isolated individuals back into the fold.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to remember, based on all this sociological data, that addiction and mental health struggles are deeply systemic economic health issues. They are not individual moral failings. So if you or someone you know is struggling right now, please know you are not alone. In the U.S., you can call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at any time. It's totally free, completely confidential, and available 24/7.
The American dream was originally built on the premise that everyone deserves a real chance at a stable, dignified life, regardless of whether they have a fancy college degree. To save the working class, we have to recognize this invisible epidemic and start rebuilding that dream from the ground up. So I'll leave you with this. Looking at the data and the deep structural shifts we've explored in this explainer today, what specific steps do you think are most necessary to ensure that everyone gets a chance at a dignified life? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.